You know that idea from your very first economics class, the one that's supposed to be the bedrock of how markets work? Well, what if it's less of a reality and more of a myth? Today, we're digging into the idea of perfect competition. And you can't talk about this without starting with the man himself, Adam Smith. His whole idea of the invisible hand is legendary, right? It's this beautiful theory that if we all just chase our own self-interest, the market magically guides us to the best possible outcome for everyone. It's a really powerful concept, and it has shaped policy for centuries. But that brings us to the one big, nagging question we're tackling today. Has this perfectly balanced, self-correcting market ever really existed outside of a textbook? All right, so before we can bust the myth, we have to understand exactly what the myth is. So let's do a quick refresher on the Econ 101 definition. What are we even talking about when we say perfect competition? So at its heart, it's a market where you have tons and tons of small companies all duking it out, but no single one is big enough to actually control anything, especially the price. They're all what we call price takers, not price makers. In theory, it's the gold standard for a healthy market. But here's the catch. For this perfect world to exist, a whole bunch of really strict conditions have to be met. You need a huge number of companies, and they all have to be selling the exact same thing. Think bushels of wheat, not different brands of smartphones. Plus, it has to be super easy for new companies to jump into the market and for old ones to leave. I mean, how often does that really happen all at once? Okay, so that's the nice, clean theory. But the second we step out of the classroom and into the real world, well, things get a whole lot messier. It starts to look less like a happy, harmonious market and a lot more like an all-out battlefield. And this slide just nails the disconnect. The theory promises us this peaceful balance. But the reality, as our source material argues, is that the natural state of a market isn't balanced at all. It's a brutal, grinding process where the goal is to eliminate your rivals, consolidate power, and, if you can, become a monopoly. In fact, this drive to consolidate is so incredibly strong that even when the government steps in and breaks up a monopoly, the pieces just seem to have this magnetic attraction. They find a way to pull themselves back together over time. And the poster child for this is the story of AT&T. Back in the 80s, Ma Bell was the monopoly. Regulators shattered it into 7 smaller baby bells. But you fast forward to today, after decades of mergers and deals, and what do you have? The market is once again dominated by just 3 giants, and one of them is basically the old AT&T, just stitched back together. So if the market naturally creates these giants, how do they defend their turf once they've claimed it? They don't just keep competing, they start building fortresses. And in economics, we call these barriers to entry. And if you want a masterclass in how to build one of these corporate fortresses, look no further than Tetra Pak, the giant in food packaging. These guys were absolute experts at locking the competition out. The European Commission actually launched this massive investigation, and their conclusion was simple and pretty damning. They found that Tetra Pak's contracts were specifically designed to make its customers, and I quote, entirely dependent. So how on earth did they do that? Well, it was a pretty clever, multi-pronged attack. They used tied sales, which meant if you wanted to use their packaging machines, you had to buy their cartons. They locked customers into incredibly long leases, sometimes longer than the useful life of the machine itself. If a machine broke, only Tetra Pak was allowed to fix it. And here's the final wall of the fortress. If you tried to switch to a competitor, the penalties could be worth more than the machines you were leasing. There was no escape. And this wasn't just a one-off strategy. A nail gun maker called Hilti used a very similar playbook. They tied the sale of their patented cartridge strips to the purchase of their own nails. It was a simple, brutal way of boxing out any other company that just wanted to make and sell compatible nails. Okay, so building a fortress is one thing. That's defense. But what happens when a scrappy little competitor actually finds a way to sneak past the walls? Well, that's when a dominant company can switch from defense to offense. And that's when we open up the predator's playbook. The classic story here is the showdown between a chemical giant, Axo, and a small firm called ECS. It started when ECS decided to compete with Axo in its most profitable market. Axo's response was swift and brutal. First came direct threats, and when ECS got a court order to stop the threats, Axo just switched tactics. They launched these targeted, incredibly aggressive price cuts aimed only at ECS's most important customers. So, what makes this the textbook case of predatory pricing? The European Commission basically laid out the recipe. Number one, AKZO was the dominant player in the market. Two, with the threats, there was clear evidence of predatory intent. Three, they proved AKZO was selling its products for less than they cost to make. And four, they aimed all this firepower at a much smaller, weaker rival they knew couldn't sustain a price war. Now, hearing all that, it sounds like a pretty clear-cut case, an obvious penalty. But for the regulators, who are basically the referees of the market, drawing that line between just being a tough competitor and being an illegal predator is an incredibly difficult job. It's almost impossible. And this quote right here just perfectly captures the dilemma. The very thing we're calling an offense, low pricing, is also the thing we love most about competition. We all want lower prices. So how can you tell when a good deal for the customer becomes an illegal weapon against a competitor? It is, as the source says, a very subtle task. To try and solve this riddle, regulators came up with a two-part test. First, they look at the whole market and ask a key question. If this predator succeeds, could they realistically raise prices later to make back all the money they're losing now? And then part two, they look at the company's conduct. They get out the spreadsheets and try to figure out if the prices are actually below the company's own costs. But guess what? Even with this formal test, it's not foolproof. In that huge landmark AKZO case, critics later argued that the regulators didn't think hard enough about whether a new competitor could have just entered the market if AKZO tried to jack up its prices later on. It just shows how incredibly complex this all is, even for the experts, which leaves us with this massive headache. I mean, think about it. If low prices can get you in trouble and high prices are a sign you're a monopoly, what in the world is the right price? How are you supposed to keep markets fair when the greatest tool of competition, a low price, can also be the most effective weapon for destroying it? And that brings us right back to today. So I'll just leave you with this final thought to chew on. If a company selling packaging and a company selling nail guns could build such effective fortresses back in the 1980s, just using paper contracts and patents, what kind of impenetrable castles are today's digital giants building with their massive ecosystems, with network effects, and with all of our data? That's the question regulators are wrestling with right now.